They say silence is golden, but in the hallowed halls of old money and buried secrets, silence is not an absence of sound. It is a weapon, a shield, and sometimes a tomb where truth is left to die. But what happens when the tomb is broken open? The story begins not with a shout, but with the quiet hum of a laptop on a rainy Tuesday night in New York. Alara Vance was not in her sprawling Park Avenue penthouse, the one with views that swept over Central Park like a kingdom. She was in a small, barren apartment in Queens, a place so anonymous it felt like a ghost's waiting room. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and cheap paint, a world away from the scent of orchids and old leather that had once defined her life. On the screen, her husband, Marcus Vance, the charismatic heir to the Vance Industries fortune, stood at a podium, his handsome face a perfect mask of sorrow. He wore a Tom Ford suit, the dark gray fabric absorbing the flash of cameras as if it were absorbing the world's sympathy. His voice, practiced and steady, trembled just enough as he announced that his own wife, Alara, the woman he had vowed to cherish, had embezzled $20 million from the family's philanthropic foundation. He pledged his full cooperation with the authorities, his eyes finding the camera to speak of his heartbreak, his shock, his commitment to bringing the truth to light. Alara watched, her expression unreadable. There were no tears. The time for tears had passed weeks ago, leaving behind a hollow, desolate landscape in her soul. Now, there was only a coldness, a glacial calm that settled deep in her bones. This was not the chaotic, passionate act of a cheating husband trying to cover his tracks. This was a demolition. It was precise, calculated, and utterly devastating. He wasn't just leaving her, he was methodically erasing her from the life they had built, painting her as a villain in the story he would now control. In the stark silence of the room, punctuated only by the drumming of rain against the windowpane and the soft click of her mouse, something shifted inside her. The last embers of grief were extinguished, and from the ashes, a different kind of fire was kindled. It was not hot with rage, but cold with purpose. Marcus had started a war, confident in his power and his position. He had made only one mistake, one fatal miscalculation. The quiet, devoted lamb he thought he had sacrificed to save himself had spent years studying the wolves. And she was about to show him just how much she had learned. Before the storm, there was the calm. But for Alara Vance, it was never a true calm. It was the placid, shimmering surface of a deep and treacherous ocean. To the outside world, her life was an exquisitely crafted fairy tale. She was the brilliant, beautiful wife of Marcus Vance, the golden heir to a dynasty built on steel, concrete, and the unshakable certainty of old money. Their life was a carefully curated collection of perfect moments, captured in the glossy pages of magazines and the envious whispers of New York society. It was a life lived in the penthouse, where the city sprawled beneath them like a carpet of diamonds, a life of charity galas where champagne flowed more freely than water, and of spontaneous trips to Monaco on the family's private jet. This was the gilded cage, and for a time, Alara had mistaken the glittering bars for the warm glow of home. She had met Marcus not in a ballroom, but at a notoriously dry lecture on emerging market algorithms. She was there as a rising star in data analytics. He was there as a potential investor. While other men saw a pretty face, Marcus had seen her mind. He was captivated by the way she spoke about predictive models, the fire in her eyes as she deconstructed complex financial systems. He pursued her with a charm that was both disarming and relentless. He wasn't just the heir. He was a man who seemed to value her for her intellect, for the very core of who she was, a girl from a quiet, middle-class suburb who had built her own success through sheer grit and intelligence. He made her believe that their worlds, so vastly different, could merge into something new and beautiful. The first few years of their marriage felt like a dream. But slowly, imperceptibly, the dream began to curdle at the edges. The cage, though beautiful, began to reveal its bars. And the zookeeper was not Marcus, but his mother, Beatrice Vance. Beatrice was the true monarch of the Vance Empire, a woman forged in privilege and tempered by ruthless ambition. She was elegant, articulate, and possessed an unnerving ability to command a room with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. From the moment Ilara entered the family, Beatrice saw her not as a daughter, but as an acquisition, a variable that needed to be controlled. She never accepted Ilara's background, viewing her middle-class roots as a contamination in their pristine bloodline. Her disapproval was a masterclass in subtlety. It was never a direct insult, but 1,000 tiny cuts. It was in the way she would compliment Ilara's dress, before adding, "It's wonderful that you're so adventurous with high-street fashion, dear." It was in her constant references to our kind of people, a phrase that always left Ilara standing on the outside. Beatrice insisted that Ilara leave her demanding job. "A career is a wonderful hobby for a young woman," she'd said over lunch at the Carlisle, "but a Vance wife has duties. Your primary role, my dear, is to support Marcus, to be the flawless hostess, the silent partner." Marcus, desperate for his mother's approval, had gently echoed the sentiment. "She just wants what's best for us, Larry," he'd pleaded. "My mother's support is crucial for my future, for our future, just for a little while, until I take over from her." And so, Ilara conceded. She traded her corner office for a seat on charity boards, her data models for seating charts. She learned to differentiate between a Monet and a Manet, to smile placidly through mind-numbing conversations about polo matches and yacht maintenance. She learned the intricate dance of high society, a world where nothing was said directly and everything was understood. She became an actress, playing the part of Mrs. Marcus Vance with an award-winning performance. Marcus was her adoring director, always coaching her from the sidelines. "Mother prefers lilies to roses, Laurie. Don't mention your scholarship to Stanford, darling. It sounds like boasting. Just agree with her on this. It's easier for everyone." Each concession was a small piece of herself surrendered, a tiny crack in her own foundation. The true nature of her cage was never clearer than during the Sunday dinners at the Vance family estate in Connecticut. The house was a sprawling stone fortress, filled with priceless antiques and an oppressive, ancestral silence. Dinner was a formal affair, a ritual presided over by Beatrice from the head of a mahogany table that could seat 30. On one such evening, the conversation turned to a new tech startup that Ilara had been following. Excited to contribute something of substance, she offered a detailed analysis of their market potential and disruptive technology. She spoke with the passion and clarity of the analyst she once was. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Beatrice slowly placed her wine glass on the table, the crystal making a soft, definitive sound. "That's very technical, Ilara," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But in our world, we find that lineage and relationships are far more reliable indicators of success than these fleeting digital trends." Ilara felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to argue, to defend the world of merit and logic that she came from. But then she saw Marcus's face. He was smiling, a tight, placating smile. "Mother is right, of course," he said, reaching for Ilara's hand across the table, his touch a gentle warning. "Larry just finds these things fascinating. It's like a puzzle for her, a little hobby." He squeezed her hand, a silent plea to drop it. And in that moment, Ilara felt a profound and chilling loneliness. She was surrounded by wealth, by art, by the supposed love of her husband, but she was utterly alone. Her mind, the very thing Marcus had claimed to fall in love with, was now being dismissed as a quaint little hobby. She was a decorative object, a beautiful bird in a magnificent, gilded cage, and her husband was the one making sure the door remained locked. He did it with a loving smile and a gentle touch, which somehow made it all the more suffocating. She looked down at the perfectly polished silver, the pristine white linen, and saw not a dinner table, but a beautifully set trap. She had willingly walked into it, believing it was a sanctuary. She was only just beginning to understand the price of its beautiful, suffocating safety. The first crack in the gilded cage did not appear with a sound, but with a number. It was a single line item on a platinum credit card statement, an invoice from a 5-star hotel bar in Chicago. The amount was trivial, less than $200. But the date was a Tuesday, a day when Marcus was supposedly in a board meeting in their own building in Manhattan. Ilara, ever the analyst, noticed the discrepancy not with suspicion, but with a flicker of confusion. She managed their personal finances with the same meticulous precision she had once applied to billion-dollar portfolios. It was a habit she couldn't break, an anomaly. A piece of data that didn't fit the established pattern. She flagged it mentally and moved on, but one anomaly is often a precursor to a trend. Soon, other pieces of flawed data began to emerge. There were late-night phone calls that Marcus would take on the terrace, his back turned, his voice a low, urgent murmur that was lost to the city winds. When she'd ask, he would wave a dismissive hand. Just a difficult investor from the Hong Kong office. The time difference is a killer. There were sudden, last-minute business trips, explained away with vague justifications about zoning permits or site inspections. His excuses were plausible, but they were also uncharacteristically opaque. Marcus had always been a storyteller, a man who painted vivid pictures of his business dealings. Now, his narratives were becoming thin, blurry sketches. Even in her growing unease, Alara's mind did not leap to the most obvious, most primal conclusion. Infidelity seemed too simple, too pedestrian for the complex ecosystem of the Vance family. Her mind, trained to identify systemic risk, went elsewhere. She began to suspect that Marcus was in financial trouble. Perhaps he was orchestrating a secret deal, a high-stakes venture outside the rigid control of his mother, a desperate bid to finally prove himself. The thought filled her not with anger, but with a wave of protective concern. She saw him as a man struggling under the immense weight of his legacy, and she, his wife, was being shut out. She wanted to help, to be his partner, not just in society, but in strategy. The silence, she believed, was born of his pride, his fear of failure. It was a miscalculation she would later recognize as catastrophically naive. This concern gave her the justification she needed to do what her instincts were screaming at her to do: dig deeper. She told herself it wasn't snooping, it was risk assessment. One evening, when Marcus was out for another one of his late-night meetings, Alara went into their shared home office, a magnificent room of dark wood and leather overlooking the city. She sat down at her old terminal, the one she rarely used anymore, and logged into their secure family server. She was looking for financial statements, investment portfolios, anything that might point to a risky side project. What she found instead was a series of heavily encrypted folders hidden deep within a directory labeled Archived Household Accounts. This was wrong. Marcus was not tech-savvy. He was a man of handshakes and charisma, not firewalls and encryption keys. He relied on the Vance Industries IT department for everything. This level of security was personal, deliberate, and meant to keep someone out. It occurred to her, with a sudden chill, that the someone was probably her. For a data analyst, a locked file is not a barrier, it is an invitation. Her old skills, dormant but not forgotten, came rushing back. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, lines of code appearing on the screen. It took her less than an hour to bypass the encryption. The folder opened, and its contents were not what she expected. There were no panicked spreadsheets or evidence of gambling debts. Instead, there was a single, meticulously prepared prospectus for a shell corporation named Ethelred Holdings, LLC, registered in the Cayman Islands. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't the signature of a man in financial trouble. This was the work of a predator. This was a structure designed for one purpose: to move vast sums of money, silently and invisibly. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened the incorporation documents. She scanned the PDF, her eyes searching for the details. The initial capitalization was $10 million, wired in 2 separate installments. The corporate purpose was listed as strategic acquisitions. Then she saw the signatories. The first name was the one she expected: Marcus Thorne Vance. She felt a wave of dizziness, the betrayal now a physical thing, a pressure building in her chest. But she forced herself to keep reading, to see the whole picture. She scrolled down to the section listing secondary signatories and beneficiaries, the partners in this secret enterprise. Her breath caught in her throat. The name on the screen seemed to glow with a malevolent energy: Isabella Rossi. The world tilted on its axis. Isabella Rossi. It wasn't just a name, it was a ghost from her past. They had been rivals at Stanford, two brilliant women on parallel tracks. But where Alara was driven by a passion for logic and ethical systems, Isabella was fueled by a cold, relentless ambition. She was a woman who saw rules as suggestions and people as assets to be leveraged. Isabella, now a notoriously ruthless corporate lawyer, specialized in hostile takeovers. The last Alara had heard, she was the rising star at a cutthroat Wall Street firm. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced in Alara's mind. Isabella, at a university competition, leaning in and whispering, "You know, Alara, your problem is that you believe in playing fair. The real world doesn't give trophies for that." Suddenly, all the anomalous data points clicked into place, forming a picture of breathtaking cruelty. The hotel bar in Chicago Isabella's firm had an office there, the late-night calls about investors, the new, aggressive corporate jargon. It wasn't an affair. To call it that would be to diminish its calculated malice. An affair was a crime of passion. This was a conspiracy. This was a business merger of ambition and betrayal. Marcus and Isabella weren't just sleeping together. They were building an empire on the back of his family, and the first asset they had decided to liquidate was Alara herself. She stared at the screen, at the two names linked together in legal, binding secrecy. The first crack had appeared, and it was not a crack. It was a chasm, opening right under her feet, revealing a fall into an abyss, far deeper and darker than she could ever have imagined. In the silent, opulent office, Alara finally understood. The cage hadn't just been to keep her in. It was designed to keep her blind. For a few short hours, Alara Vance held a secret that she believed gave her power. She sat in the cavernous home office, the city lights twinkling below, a silent witness to her shattered reality. The documents proving the existence of Aethelred Holdings and Isabella Rossi were a loaded gun. Her analytical mind, even in its state of shock, was already running through scenarios. She would not scream or throw vases. She would be strategic. She would gather more evidence, create an unbreachable case, and then confront Marcus, not as a weeping wife, but as an adversary who knew all his secrets. She decided to wait until morning, to let him walk into a carefully laid trap of her own design. It was a logical, calculated decision. It was also the last mistake she would make as a free woman. The next morning, the apartment was silent. Marcus was gone. A single, crisp note was left on the kitchen island. Early breakfast meeting with the board. We need to talk later. The "we need to talk" was a chilling postscript. Before she could process it, her phone rang. It was Marcus's executive assistant, a woman named Chloe, who had always treated Alara with a warm, almost conspiratorial kindness. Today, her voice was clipped, stripped of all warmth. "Mrs. Vance," she said, the formal address a sudden, jarring alarm bell. "You are requested at an emergency meeting of the board of directors at 10 a.m. sharp." In the main boardroom on the 50th floor, Alara's blood turned to ice. Wives were not summoned to board meetings. "Chloe, what is this about?" she asked, her own voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. There was a pause. "I'm not at liberty to say." "Mrs. Vance, please be prompt." The line went dead. She still didn't understand. Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them led to the truth. She thought Beatrice must have discovered Marcus's secret company, that he was about to be exposed, and that he needed her there for support. She still, foolishly, thought they were on the same side of some battle. She dressed with automated precision in a charcoal gray sheath dress and understated pearls. Armor for a battle she could not yet comprehend. The doorman, who usually greeted her with a wide smile, just nodded curtly. The familiar ride up the gleaming brass elevator felt like a slow ascent to the gallows. The air on the executive floor was thick with a tense, unnatural silence. When she walked into the boardroom, she finally understood. This was not a discussion. It was in tribunal. The board members, all aging men who owed their fortunes to the Vance family, were seated around the monstrous granite table, their faces grim and unreadable. At the head of the table sat Beatrice, her posture ramrod straight, her expression as impassive as a marble statue. Beside her sat Marcus. He looked pale, his eyes fixed on a point on the table just in front of him, refusing to meet her gaze. And standing near the head of the table, holding a leather-bound portfolio, was Isabella Rossi. She was not there as a mistress caught in the act. She was there in her full power, radiating a predatory confidence. She gave Ilara a brief, triumphant smirk. "Ilara, thank you for coming," Beatrice began, her voice slicing through the silence. "We have convened this emergency session to address a matter of grave importance. A significant financial breach has been discovered within the Vance Foundation." Ilara felt a flicker of hope. They knew. But then Beatrice nodded toward Isabella. "We have retained Miss Rossi as special counsel to investigate this matter. She has a presentation for the board." Isabella stepped forward, her heels clicking decisively on the floor. "Thank you, Madam Chairwoman." The large screen at the end of the room lit up. What appeared was a dizzying flowchart of bank accounts, wire transfers, and shell corporations, all linked with damning precision. It was a masterful work of fiction, a phantom enterprise built in the digital shadows. Isabella's voice was crisp and devoid of emotion as she narrated the fabricated crime. She explained how $20 million had been systematically siphoned from the Foundation's accounts over 18 months, funneled through untraceable entities, and deposited into a final account in Zurich. "Through meticulous forensic accounting," Isabella continued, "we were able to trace the origin of every single transfer. The digital signature, the IP address, the trading patterns used to mask the transactions. They all lead back to one source." She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes landing on Ilara with cold satisfaction. "They lead back to Ilara Vance." A collective gasp went through the room. On the screen, Ilara saw her own life twisted into a weapon against her. They had used her knowledge, her past. Isabella presented logs showing Ilara accessing the financial servers at odd hours. She presented an analysis of Ilara's modest upbringing, expertly painting a picture of a greedy outsider who had married into the family with the intent to steal. It was brilliant. It was diabolical. "This is a lie," Ilara said, her voice shaking but clear. "This is fabricated. Marcus, tell them." She turned to her husband, her eyes pleading with him to end this nightmare. This was the moment. He could stop it all. He finally lifted his head, and she saw nothing in his eyes. No love, no remorse, not even fear. Only a chilling, vacant emptiness. He took a deep breath, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. A perfect, theatrical performance. "I can't believe you would do this, Ilara," he said, his voice cracking. "After everything my family has given you, how could you?" That was the moment her heart truly broke. It wasn't a shatter, but a silent, complete disintegration. The rest was a blur. Beatrice called for a vote. It was unanimous. Her position with the Foundation was terminated. Criminal charges would be filed. Beatrice looked at her, her eyes glinting with a victory she had waited years for. "Security will see you out." Two large, impassive men stepped forward. They didn't touch her, but their presence herded her out of the room, down the long corridor, past the staring, whispering employees, and into the elevator. They took her to her small courtesy office, where a single cardboard box sat on the desk, filled with the few personal trinkets she had kept there. Her corporate ID was taken from her. Her phone, a company device, was remotely wiped in front of her. She was escorted through the main lobby, a public shaming, and pushed out onto the bustling sidewalk of 6th Avenue. Dazed, she stood there for a moment, clutching her box of memories. The city noise was a deafening roar. She mechanically hailed a taxi, giving the driver the address to the penthouse. The ride was silent. When they arrived, she pulled out her wallet, her hands on autopilot. She handed the driver her credit card. He ran it. A harsh, buzzing sound filled the cab. "Declined, lady." She fumbled for another card, her debit card. Declined. A cold, sickening realization washed over her. It wasn't just a firing, it was an excommunication. They had frozen everything. She was locked out of her own life, standing on the pavement, with a useless piece of plastic in her hand and a cardboard box at her feet. Alara Vance understood the full scope of their strike. It wasn't just preemptive, it was total. The fall was not a single dramatic plunge. It was a series of brutal, jarring impacts, each one shattering another piece of the life Alara Vance once knew. After the taxi drove away, leaving her stranded and cashless on the curb of her own former kingdom, the first instinct was survival. The gilded cage had vanished, leaving her exposed to a world she was no longer equipped to navigate. She couldn't call her parents. The shame was a physical barrier in her throat, and she refused to let the fallout of the Vance's war scorch their quiet, ordinary lives. Using the last crumpled bills from her wallet, she took the subway, a disorienting descent into the city's veins, finally emerging in the anonymous sprawl of Queens. There, she found a room in a motel that charged by the week, a place that smelled of bleach and quiet desperation. This was the first level of her new abyss. The next impact was the death of her name. Her identity, once a source of pride and access, was now a mark of infamy. At a corner newsstand, her own face stared back at her from the front page of a tabloid, a candid photo from a gala where she was laughing, now twisted by the headline, "The Park Avenue Pilferer." On the small television in her motel room, she watched Marcus's press conference. He stood before a wall of microphones, his face a mask of noble suffering, talking about the sanctity of charity and the profound personal betrayal he had endured. He was not just divorcing her, he was sanctifying himself by her damnation. The world didn't know the woman who solved algorithms and loved the quiet of a library. They now knew this new Alara, a greedy, social climbing monster of his creation. Then came the social death, a quiet and swift execution. The phone book in her mind, once filled with the names of friends and confidants, became a graveyard. She called Caroline, a woman with whom she'd shared countless brunches and secrets. The phone rang 4 times before Caroline picked up. "Hello?" Her voice was wary. "Caroline, it's me, Alara." There was a sharp intake of breath, followed by a long, terrible silence. "Alara," Caroline finally said, her voice a strained, distant whisper. "I saw the news. I can't talk to you. My husband, his business, you understand." Before Alara could even respond, the line went dead. The click was as final as a coffin lid shutting. She tried others. Calls went straight to voicemail. Emails bounced back, her address blocked. The people who had once clamored for her attention now treated her like a contagion. She was learning the cardinal rule of their world. Loyalty was not to people, but to power. And she had no power left. The deepest, coldest level of the abyss was the law. With no funds, she was assigned a public defender, a man named Arthur Chen. His office was a cramped, cluttered space in a crumbling downtown building, a universe away from the mahogany-paneled law firms of the Vance Dynasty. Chen was a man in his 50s with tired, intelligent eyes and a suit that was 10 years out of style. He had the weary air of a man who fought losing battles for a living. He gestured for her to sit, and without preamble, he laid out the case the district attorney had built against her. It was a fortress of fabricated evidence, constructed by Isabella Rossi's team with terrifying skill. Forged digital signatures, doctored server logs, sworn affidavits from Vance employees attesting to her suspicious behavior. "It's a beautiful case," Chen said, with the detached admiration of a fellow craftsman, "a work of art. They've left no room for doubt. They've painted a picture, and every juror in this city will want to believe it." Alara stared at him, bewildered. "But it's not true. None of it is true. I am innocent, Mr." Chen leaned back in his squeaking chair and sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 lost causes. "Mrs. Vance, let me be frank. Your innocence is a story. The Vances, with their army of lawyers and PR agents, have another story. It's a better story. It's cleaner, it's more dramatic, and right now, it's the only one anyone is willing to buy. They have influence that you can't imagine. The DA is an old friend of the family. The judge they'll likely get is a Vance appointee." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. "They're offering a plea deal," he said, his voice flat. "Plead guilty to 1 count of grand larceny in the 2nd degree. They'll drop the other charges. The DA will recommend a sentence of 3 to 5 years. With good behavior, you could be out in 2. The words hung in the airless room. 2 years, 5 years, in a prison, for a crime she didn't commit. And if I fight it, she whispered, if I tell the truth, Mr. Chen looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of sympathy in his tired eyes. If you fight this and lose, he said softly, they will make an example of you. They will bury you under the courthouse. You'll be looking at 15, maybe 20 years. Your word against the entire Vance empire. Those are not good odds. That night, back in the sterile silence of her motel room, Alara finally hit the bottom. The choice they had given her was an impossible torture. Surrender her name and her freedom for a lie, or cling to the truth and risk losing the rest of her life. She was utterly, completely alone. There was no one to call, nowhere to run. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, a pale, haunted stranger looking back at her. She replayed her life with Marcus, but this time, the movie was a horror film. Every loving gesture now seemed like a manipulation. Every tender word felt like a lie. Her love, her trust, her belief in his goodness, they had been her greatest vulnerabilities, and he had exploited them all with surgical precision. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. But as she sat there in the darkness, something else began to stir in the depths of the abyss. Below the pain, below the despair, a different kind of energy was gathering. It was the cold, hard bedrock of pure rage. She had nothing left to lose. They had taken her name, her money, her friends, her future. They had burned her entire world to the ground. They thought they had left her for dead in the ruins, but they had forgotten one thing. Sometimes, from the deepest abyss, a survivor learns how to claw their way out, and they are no longer afraid of the dark. The days leading up to the plea deal deadline bled into one another, a monotonous gray fog of despair. Ilara's world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the dingy motel room. The television remained off, a silent black mirror. The newspapers went unread. She existed in a state of suspended animation, trapped between 2 impossible futures: a shorter prison sentence built on a lie, or a lifetime stolen from her for clinging to the truth. Mr. Chen's pragmatic advice echoed in her mind. Innocence is a story, and right now they have a much better one. She felt the walls of their story closing in, the weight of it pressing the air from her lungs. She was at the very bottom of the abyss, and she was beginning to forget there was ever a Sunday. The turning point came not with a flash of light, but with a quiet knock on the door. It was late afternoon. The sound was so out of place in her silent world that she flinched. Her first thought was that they had found her. The police, or worse, a private investigator sent by the Vances to serve her with more papers, to tighten the screws. She held her breath, listening. Another knock, softer this time, more patient. Cautiously, she crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. She waited a full minute before slowly turning the knob and opening the door a crack. On the worn, faded carpet lay a plain manila envelope. There was no stamp, no return address. It had been placed there by hand. In neat, unassuming block letters, it was addressed to Ilara Linden. Her maiden name. The name of the woman she was before she became a Vance. It was a ghost from another life. A cold dread mixed with a desperate curiosity as she brought the envelope inside and locked the door. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside, there was no letter, no threatening note, just a single object that slid into her palm, a cheap, black plastic USB drive, the kind given away at corporate events. It was old, slightly scratched. For a moment, she thought it must be a trap, a tracking device, or a virus designed to destroy whatever digital footprint she had left. But she was already destroyed. What more could they possibly take? She needed a neutral device, a computer that couldn't be traced back to her. The public library, a few blocks away, became her sanctuary. She found an empty terminal in a quiet corner, the air smelling of old paper and dust. With a sense of grim finality, she slid the drive into the USB port. A single file appeared on the screen: Compass, MP3. Her finger hovered over the mouse. She put on the library's flimsy headphones, the cheap foam pressing against her ears, and clicked play. A faint hiss, the clinking of ice cubes in a glass, and then a voice from the grave. It was Marcus Vance Sr., a man she'd met only a handful of times before he passed away from a sudden heart attack. His voice was just as she remembered it, a low, thoughtful baritone, laced with a weary kindness. And then another voice, younger, clearer, full of the earnest, ambitious energy that had first made her fall in love. It was Marcus, her Marcus, from years ago. "Your mother is a brilliant woman, Marcus," his father was saying, his words slow and deliberate. "But her brilliance is a cold fire. She sees the world as a chessboard, and people, even family, are just pieces to be moved or sacrificed for the win. Don't ever let her convince you that her ambition is the same as your integrity." "But she built this company," the younger Marcus argued, his voice full of defensive loyalty. "She wants to protect it, to protect us." There was a sigh on the recording, a sound of profound sadness. "She wants to conquer, son. There's a difference. When I'm gone, the pressure on you will be immense. She will try to forge you into a weapon of her own making. I'm leaving you more than just money, Marcus. I'm leaving you a choice. The choice to be her king or your own man. All I ask is this: don't ever lose your moral compass. It's the only thing they can't take from you unless you give it away." The recording ended. Ilara sat motionless, the library's quiet hum fading into a dull roar in her ears. She played it again and again. Each time, the words chiseled away at the layers of her grief. This audio file couldn't be used in court. It didn't prove her innocence. It did something far more important. It gave her the truth. It was a ghost's validation, a final warning from a man who had seen the rot in his own house. She hadn't been a fool to love the man on that recording. That man, the one who wrestled with his conscience, had been real, but he had made a choice. He had faced the test his father laid out for him, and he had failed completely. He had willingly handed over his compass. The pain that lanced through her was sharp and clarifying. It was no longer the muddy, self-blaming grief of a victim. It was the clean, pure grief for the man he could have been, and a white-hot rage for the monster he had chosen to become. She didn't just feel betrayed by her husband. She felt betrayed by the memory of the good man he had pretended to be. She walked out of the library as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with orange and purple. The city no longer felt like a hostile labyrinth. It felt like a territory, a battlefield. The plea deal was a joke, a move on a chessboard she was never meant to win. Mr. Chen was right. She couldn't win their game, so she would create a new one. Her mind, the analytical engine that they had tried to dismiss as a hobby, began to fire up. The fog of despair was burning away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. The Vance Empire, once an impenetrable fortress, now looked like a system, a complex algorithm of power, greed, and secrets. And any system could be broken. Back in her motel room, the air was different. It was no longer a tomb of despair. It was a staging ground, a war room. She would not take their deal. She would not let them write her story. She picked up the cheap notepad from the bedside table and a pen. The frantic, desperate woman who had checked into this motel was gone. In her place was someone else, someone colder, calmer, and infinitely more dangerous. At the top of the first page, she didn't write a legal defense strategy. She wrote a name, Beatrice. Underneath it, another, Isabella, and then the last one, Marcus. It wasn't a plan, not yet. It was a list. And as she looked at the three names that had destroyed her world, Ilara Vance felt the last of her tears dry up forever, replaced by the spark of a terrible, righteous vengeance. The hunt was about to begin. The day the plea deal was set to expire, Ilara Vance ceased to exist. To the legal system, she became a fugitive, a defendant who had fled justice, her guilt now presumed in the court of public opinion. A bench warrant was issued for her arrest. The Vances, through their PR machine, expressed their deep disappointment and feigned concern for her well-being, all while reinforcing the narrative of her guilt. But Ilara was not running. She was burrowing. She was shedding the skin of her old life, a name and a face that were now liabilities, and methodically erasing her trail. She left the motel in Queens, taking nothing but her small stash of cash and the laptop containing her list of names. She became a ghost, melting into the city's anonymous millions. Her new life began in a cramped, windowless basement apartment in a forgotten corner of Brooklyn, rented under a false name with cash. The room was a concrete box, the opposite of the airy, sunlit penthouse she once called home. It was a tomb, but it was also a fortress. This was where the hunted would become the hunter. Over the next few weeks, she built her arsenal. She frequented cash-only electronics stores, buying used, untraceable hardware, powerful processors, extra hard drives, a half-dozen monitors. She assembled a formidable computer system herself, a Frankenstein's monster of mismatched parts that hummed with latent power. She ran her own Ethernet cables, creating a closed network, a digital island completely isolated from the outside world until she chose to connect. Her days took on a new, monastic rhythm. Gone were the charity, luncheons, and society fittings. Her life was now a cycle of intense focus, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning, singular purpose. The skills that had made her a star analyst on Wall Street were now repurposed for a darker art. She had once used data to predict market fluctuations. Now she used it to map the Vance's empire of influence. She created a vast, intricate mind map, connecting board members, politicians, judges, and journalists, identifying the invisible threads of obligation and corruption that held their world together. She scraped social media, financial reports, and public records, building detailed psychological profiles of her enemies, learning their habits, their vanities, their fears. She became a ghost in the machine, using layers of VPNs and routing her connection through servers in a dozen different countries. She would slip into public Wi-Fi networks like a phantom. From there, she began to probe the digital perimeter of Vance Industries. She wasn't a hacker, not yet. She was a reconnaissance expert. She studied their corporate website source code, identified the software running their servers, and analyzed their login protocols. She found the digital blueprints of their fortress, but the walls were higher and thicker than she had imagined. The internal network, where the real secrets were kept, was protected by a proprietary security system, a digital Cerberus that was far beyond her ability to bypass. Every attempt she made to get closer was met with an invisible, impenetrable barrier. She could see the castle, she could map its defenses, but she could not find a way inside. And she knew, with the chilling certainty of a professional, that to try and fail would be to leave a digital footprint they could trace right back to her concrete box. She had reached the limit of her skills. She needed a different kind of weapon. She needed a gatekeeper. Her mind dredged up a name from her past, a ghost from the Vance Industries machine itself, Daniel Cho. 4 years ago, Vance Industries had acquired a boutique cybersecurity firm where Daniel was the brilliant, iconoclastic chief architect. He was a prodigy, a digital native who saw code as poetry. Shortly after the acquisition, the firm suffered a catastrophic data breach. The official story, crafted by Beatrice and Marcus, was that Daniel had been negligent, his protocols lax. He was made the public scapegoat, fired in disgrace, and systematically blacklisted from the industry. Alara had been on the periphery of the deal and had always felt the story was too convenient, the blame too perfectly placed. She suspected Daniel hadn't been negligent. She suspected he had discovered something he wasn't supposed to see. He was a loose end they had brutally tied off. Finding him was a risk, but it was the only one she had. He was, like her, a ghost. It took her 2 weeks of careful, painstaking digital forensics, tracking old IP addresses and deleted social media profiles, to find him. He was working under a different name at a small, cluttered computer repair shop in the Bronx, a genius hiding in plain sight. She walked into the shop on a rainy afternoon. Daniel looked up from a dismantled laptop, his eyes narrowed with instant suspicion. He was thin, with dark, intense eyes that missed nothing. He recognized her immediately. "Alara Vance," he said, his voice flat and laced with contempt. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here." Alara didn't flinch. "I'm not Alara Vance anymore," she said, her voice quiet but firm. That person is a character in a story they wrote. My name is Alara Linden, and I believe we have a common enemy." He scoffed. "You are the enemy. One of them." She had anticipated this. She reached into her bag and placed the small, black USB drive on the counter between them. On this drive is a recording of Marcus's father warning him about Beatrice's greed and ruthlessness. "I am a fugitive because I found out Marcus and his new partner, Isabella Rossi, are running an illegal offshore scheme to fund a hostile takeover. They framed me for the money they were stealing. They used my knowledge of their systems to do it." Daniel's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He was listening. "They didn't just fire you, Daniel," she continued, her voice low and intense. "They erased your reputation. They rewrote your life's work into a story of failure to cover their own crimes. I know how that feels. They are doing the same thing to me. This isn't about money for me anymore. It's about taking back the truth." That was the word that broke through his armor. Truth. The thing that had been stolen from him. He stared at her for a long moment, the sounds of the city outside fading into the background. He saw not the polished socialite from the news, but a fellow exile, another ghost haunted by the same machine. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice now a low growl. "I want to get inside," she said. "I've mapped their entire external network architecture. I know their protocols, their firewalls, but I can't get through their security daemon. It was your design, wasn't it? Before they corrupted it." A slow, grim smile touched Daniel's lips for the first time. The smile of a master returning to his craft. He took the USB drive. "Let's see what you have." Back in her basement lair, the two ghosts went to work. Alara brought up her maps on the monitors, explaining her analysis. Daniel listened, his eyes scanning the data, seeing things she couldn't. He pointed to a line of code. "There," he said. "After they fired me, they upgraded everything, but they were arrogant. They built their new castle on top of my old foundation. They never patched the maintenance backdoor I built into the original source code. They probably don't even know it's there." He began to type, his fingers moving with a speed and grace that was mesmerizing. Lines of code scrolled across the screen. "They built a fortress," Daniel murmured, a flicker of vengeful fire in his eyes. "But they got lazy. They forgot that the man who designed the lock still has a key." The alliance was forged. The analyst and the hacker, the strategist and the ghost. Together, they were about to turn that key. The real war was about to begin. With Daniel at the keyboard, the digital fortress of Vance Industries became a permeable membrane. His fingers moved with an unnerving combination of speed and surgical precision, typing lines of code that were like ghost keys turning invisible locks. "I'm in," he whispered, the words hanging in the tense, cool air of the basement. "The maintenance backdoor is still active. They were arrogant. They built a skyscraper on my foundation, but never checked the basement door." Being inside was not a moment of triumph. It was a plunge into the deep, cold ocean. They were behind enemy lines, surrounded by digital tripwires and silent alarms. Every keystroke, every data packet moved, had to be a whisper, not a shout. The ghost and the gatekeeper were in the machine. The Vance Industries server was a labyrinth, a digital reflection of the family's own convoluted and secretive nature. There were the public-facing servers for accounting and HR, brightly lit rooms that Daniel warned were certainly monitored. But then there were the shadow servers, the private, encrypted domains of the top executives, where the real business was done. "Forget the official ledgers," Alara directed, her voice low, her eyes scanning a network map on one of the monitors. "That's where they put the lies they want everyone to see. Go for Marcus's private project server. The one codenamed Project Midas." Daniel's fingers danced. He bypassed Marcus's personal security with a frightening ease, exploiting the vanity of a man who used his dog's name and his birth year as a password. Once inside, they found not a single master plan, but thousands of fragmented files, emails, encrypted chats, partial spreadsheets. It was a digital breadcrumb trail, but for an analyst like Alara, it was a gold mine. She began to piece it together, finding communications between Marcus and a notoriously predatory hedge fund. The pattern was unmistakable. "They're shorting a stock," she breathed, her mind connecting the dots. "A massive position. They're betting a company is going to fail." The company was Helios Innovations, a brilliant and disruptive clean energy firm that was on the verge of a major breakthrough. It was also the chief rival to a stagnant fossil fuel subsidiary that Beatrice refused to sell. "This isn't just a bet, Daniel," Alara explained, the scale of the scheme beginning to dawn on her. "This is a planned execution. They're not just predicting a fire, they're going to light the match." The match, they discovered, was in Isabella Rossi's files. Her server was a far harder target, protected with the kind of paranoid, multi-layered encryption only a corporate lawyer could devise. It took Daniel the better part of a day, a sustained and silent cyber battle, to find a vulnerability. When he finally broke through, they found the other half of the conspiracy, the distort part of their plan. Isabella had spent months compiling a dossier on Helios. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, a toxic blend of half-truths, embellished rumors, and outright fabrications. There were accusations of accounting fraud, faked safety reports, and a scandalous and false story about the CEO's personal life, all packaged and ready to be leaked to a famously unscrupulous journalist on the payroll of a rival media network. The timeline was laid out with chilling precision. They would wait 2 more weeks, until the day after Helios announced its quarterly earnings. Then, they would unleash the smear campaign. The resulting panic would cause the stock to plummet, allowing them to close their short positions for a gargantuan profit, and then use that profit to buy up the wreckage of Helios for pennies on the dollar. The $20 million they had framed Alara for was nothing. It was merely the seed money, the first buy-in for a game whose stakes were in the hundreds of millions. They had them. It was all there, a clear-cut case of criminal market manipulation. Enough to send Marcus and Isabella to prison for decades. But as Alara stared at the numbers, at the sheer scale of the greed, a cold sliver of doubt entered her mind. This wasn't Marcus's style. His ambition was driven by a need for his mother's approval, not by this level of Leviathan greed. This scheme was too vast, too audacious, too utterly ruthless. This bore the signature of a different artist. This felt like Beatrice. "There's something more here," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. "We're only seeing part of the picture. We have to get into Beatrice's server." Daniel physically recoiled from the keyboard. "No, absolutely not. Alara, her server is the digital equivalent of Fort Knox. It's not just encrypted, it's air-gapped, honey-trapped, and monitored by a security team that used to work for the NSA. Touching it is suicide. They'll detect us in a nanosecond." "We have to," Alara insisted, her eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "She's the source. I can feel it. Everything leads back to her." What followed was the most dangerous act of their partnership. Daniel, seeing the conviction in her eyes, agreed. He devised a plan of breathtaking audacity. He would create a system-wide network glitch, a cascade of minor, meaningless error reports that would momentarily distract the security team. Giving him a window of just a few seconds to slip into Beatrice's server, copy the root directory, and slip out again. It was the digital equivalent of snatching a wallet from a king while his entire royal guard was watching. The tension in the basement was thick enough to suffocate. Daniel began to type, his face illuminated by the scrolling lines of code. On one screen, a cascade of fake error messages began flooding the system. "Now," he hissed. He executed the breach. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing and the frantic clicking of the keyboard. Then, a progress bar flashed and disappeared. "I'm out," he breathed, sweat beading on his forehead as he furiously erased their tracks. They spent the next hour decrypting the data they had stolen from the Queen's throne room. What they found made the plot against Helios look like child's play. Beatrice wasn't just aware of the plan, she was its architect. Marcus's Ethelred Holdings was a mere subsidiary, a decoy. The real profits, a staggering 80%, were being funneled through a second, more secret channel into a labyrinth of trusts and accounts controlled solely by Beatrice. Marcus was risking everything for a mere 20% cut of his own mother's scheme. But the final file was the most horrifying. It was a set of legal documents, drafted by Isabella, to be enacted in case of emergency. It was a contingency plan designed to firewall the entire conspiracy around Marcus. It contained pre-written press statements for Beatrice, decrying her son's reckless ambition and betrayal of the family's trust. It was a kill switch. If anything went wrong, Beatrice was fully prepared to cut her own son loose and feed him to the wolves, just as she had done to them. Ilara leaned back, a bitter, mirthless laugh escaping her lips. Daniel just stared at the screen, his face pale. The rot wasn't just in the branches, it was in the very root of the Vance dynasty. Marcus wasn't a king plotting a coup. He was a pawn, a willing and disposable piece in a game so monstrous he probably didn't even understand it. Ilara had thought she was fighting to clear her name from a crime she didn't commit. She now understood the truth. She, Daniel, and even Marcus were just collateral damage in Beatrice Vance's long and bloody reign. Their enemy wasn't just a cheating husband, it was an empress. And their mission was no longer about justice, it was about dismantling an entire empire. The basement had transformed. What was once a fugitive's hideout now resembled a war room, the walls covered in network diagrams and timelines, the monitors glowing with a constellation of data points. They possessed a truth so explosive it could incinerate the entire Vance dynasty. Daniel, the hacker, saw it as a digital bomb. His instinct was to detonate it to dump the entire data cache onto the internet and let the world watch the fallout. "It's not enough," Ilara said, her voice a low counterpoint to the hum of the servers. She traced a line on the wall, connecting Beatrice's photo to a dozen offshore accounts. "We can't fight an empress with a single explosion. Beatrice Vance doesn't just have lawyers, she controls the narrative. If we dump this now, she'll call it a sophisticated forgery, a desperate act by a fugitive and a disgraced ex-employee. She'll bury the truth under an avalanche of money and influence before anyone even has a chance to understand it. We can't just drop a bomb, Daniel. We have to dismantle her entire fortress, stone by stone, from the inside out. We have to make them destroy each other." This was the new game. Not a frontal assault, but a campaign of informational and psychological warfare. Ilara, the grand strategist, began to weave her web. Her first thread was aimed at the press, but not with a cannonball of information. She needed a scalpel. She identified the perfect instrument, Julian Croft, a tenacious investigative journalist with a Pulitzer nomination and, more importantly, a permanent scar from a libel lawsuit the Vances had hit him with a decade prior. He was a shark who still tasted their blood in the water. Daniel established a communication channel, so secure, it was practically paranoid, a series of encrypted, single-use email addresses routed through a chain of international servers, designed to self-destruct after each message. The first message Ilara sent was a masterwork of temptation. It contained no grand accusations. It was just a single verifiable breadcrumb, the registration number for Aethelred Holdings, LLC, in the Cayman Islands. The message was brief. A name is not a story. But sometimes, it's a beginning. Cross-reference with Marcus Vance's flight logs from March to May. See where the story takes you. She had baited the hook. The next 2 days were a torment of waiting. Then, it appeared. A short post on Croft's professional blog, a speculative piece on the ethics of using Cayman Islands shell corporations in hostile takeover bids. He didn't mention Vance. He didn't have to. The shark was circling. The second thread of the web was designed to fray Marcus's nerves. Ilara's analysis of the Helios scheme revealed its core vulnerability. It relied on predictive models. The stock had to behave in a certain way at certain times for their plan to work. Any significant deviation would trigger alarms with their hedge fund partners. Working with a small portion of the cash Ilara had managed to hide before her assets were frozen, Daniel converted the money into untraceable cryptocurrency. He then set up a dozen anonymous micro-trading accounts. Ilara, in turn, wrote a simple but brilliant algorithm. It didn't try to manipulate the market in a major way, it simply introduced chaos. Her algorithm would execute a flurry of tiny buy orders on Helios stock at precisely the moments their models predicted a dip and sell orders when it was supposed to rise. It was financial static, a persistent, untraceable noise in their system. From the dark web forums and encrypted chats they monitored, they watched the effect. Marcus grew agitated, his messages to his partners becoming increasingly erratic. He couldn't understand the phantom volatility. Was there a leak? Was another firm moving in on their target? His paranoia was a rising tide, and it was beginning to make his partners question his competence. He was a puppet, and Alara was now pulling his strings with invisible digital threads. The third and most venomous thread was aimed at the heart of the viper's nest, Beatrice herself. This was the psychological attack, designed to turn the Empress against her own prince. The plan had two prongs. First, for the board. Daniel sent a single, anonymous email to the personal account of a notoriously risk-averse board member. The email contained one attachment, a heavily redacted spreadsheet showing a massive, unsanctioned capital outflow from a Vance subsidiary, linked only to a folder cryptically labeled Project Midas. The email text was a single sentence. Do you know what your heir is doing with your company's future? The second prong was for Beatrice alone. It was Alara's gambit, a move of breathtaking audacity. It couldn't be digital, it had to be physical, personal. Daniel located a discreet but reliable courier service in the city. Alara prepared a small, elegant box. Inside was a single, hand-carved ebony chess piece, a black king. Tucked beneath it was a small, immaculately printed card. On it was not a threat, but a string of numbers, the account number of one of Beatrice's most secret Swiss trusts, the one designated to receive her 80% share of the Helios profits. Beneath the number was a single, typewritten question. Does the prince know he's playing for the peasant's share? This was the masterstroke. The message was a silent scream. It told Beatrice that someone, somewhere, knew her ultimate secret. And its cryptic wording was designed to plant a toxic seed of doubt in her mind. Was it Marcus? Had her ambitious, foolish son discovered her betrayal? Was he planning a countermove, a coup of his own? Beatrice, a woman who trusted no one, was now being pushed to suspect the one person she thought she controlled completely. In the quiet of the basement, Alara and Daniel watched the web tremble as its victims began to struggle. Julian Croft's blog posts were becoming more specific, asking pointed questions about corporate raiders and clean energy stocks. Marcus's paranoia had escalated into open hostility with his hedge fund, who were threatening to pull out. And then came the signal they had been waiting for. They intercepted a fragment of an encrypted communication sent from Beatrice's personal server to Marcus's. It was cold, imperious, and laced with fury. It was a single, direct order. Provide a full and unconditional accounting of Project Midas. Immediately, your access to the secondary funds is hereby suspended. Alara looked at Daniel, a slow, cold smile spreading across her face. The Empress was turning on her heir. The vipers were beginning to bite each other. The intricate web, woven in the dark with threads of data and deceit, was holding fast. They hadn't exposed the crime yet. They had done something far more effective. They had turned the Vance's own defining traits, their greed, their paranoia, and their treachery into weapons against themselves. The stage for their self-destruction was now set. All that was left was to raise the curtain. The Vance Annual Legacy Gala was the crown jewel of the New York social season, a night where old money and new power convened under the guise of philanthropy. This year, it was more than a party. It was a strategic rebranding. Held in the Grand Hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, under the serene gaze of ancient statues, the theme was integrity and legacy. It was Beatrice's defiant statement to the world, a lavish attempt to scrub the stain of Alara's alleged crimes from the family name. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and money. Men in bespoke tuxedos and women in couture gowns drifted through the hall, their laughter echoing off the marble floors while an orchestra played softly. They were all there to witness the resilience of the Vance dynasty. At the center of it all stood the royal family. Beatrice, a vision in a severe, elegant black gown and the famous Vance diamonds, moved through the crowd like an empress, accepting sympathetic murmurs about her family's recent ordeal. Isabella Rossi, sleek and predatory in emerald silk, stood possessively by Marcus's side. and Marcus himself played the part of the tragic hero to perfection. He was somber, dignified, his face etched with a handsome sorrow that had the society matrons swooning. They stood there, bathed in the warm, golden light, the very picture of unbreakable power, utterly oblivious to the fact that they were attending their own public execution. Miles away, in a cold basement in Brooklyn, the real gala was taking place on a wall of glowing monitors. Alara and Daniel sat in the stark, bluish light, a world away from the champagne and chandeliers. They were the unseen gods of the evening, watching their puppets dance. On one screen was a hacked security feed of the main hall. On another, a live news broadcast. Daniel's fingers moved silently across his keyboard, a digital ghost slipping through the museum's firewalls, confirming his control of the venue's audio-visual system. Alara, her face calm and focused, was on a secure, encrypted line with the journalist, Julian Croft. "Are you ready, Julian?" she asked. His voice came back, tense with anticipation. "Ready. The story is loaded. I just need your signal." Alara looked at the monitor, showing Marcus schmoozing with a senator. "The signal is 0 hour when he is at the podium, not before." Back at the museum, the moment arrived. Beatrice glided to the stage, tapping a glass for attention. The orchestra quieted. The crowd fell silent. "This has been a trying year for our family," she began, her voice resonating with practiced gravitas. "But the Vance legacy, a legacy of integrity, is stronger than any one person's malicious actions. It is a legacy now carried by my son, a man of unimpeachable character and strength. My son, Marcus Vance." Applause rippled through the hall as Marcus took the stage, kissing his mother's cheek. He stepped up to the podium, arranging his notes. He looked out at the sea of powerful, adoring faces. "Thank you, Mother," he began. "Tonight, we are here to talk about integrity. We are here to talk about truth." In the basement, Alara leaned forward. "This is it," she whispered. "Get ready." Marcus launched into his speech, a symphony of hypocrisy. He spoke of the pain of betrayal, the importance of family, and the resilience of the human spirit. He was painting himself as the victim, the noble survivor. For in the end, he said, his voice rising with emotion, the truth will always prevail. Lies may build temporary shelters, but truth builds foundations that last for generations. "The signal is go," Alara said into her headset. "Publish now." To Daniel, she said, "Light it up." It happened in 3 perfectly synchronized waves. The first was silent. Across the city, an alert pinged on the phones of thousands of subscribers to Croft's news service. The headline was an explosion. The Vance deception, inside a multi-million-dollar fraud, and a plot to destroy a rival. The full, meticulously documented story of the Helios scheme, Ethelred Holdings, and Beatrice's betrayal went live. The second wave was visual. In the grand hall, the massive screens flanking the stage, which had been displaying a tasteful loop of the Vance family's charitable works, flickered for a single, heart-stopping second. Then the image changed. The smiling children were gone, replaced by the cold black and white text of the Ethelred Holdings Incorporation document. Marcus and Isabella's names were circled in a brutal, digital red. Marcus, blinded by the stage lights, didn't see it at first, but a confused murmur began to spread through the crowd. The third wave was the cascade. The screens began to cycle through the evidence with damning clarity. An email from Marcus to Isabella. "Helios is vulnerable. The short is in place. Prepare the dossier." A bank statement showing the initial $10 million transfer. A direct quote from Isabella's own files. "Fabricated safety report should be leaked to our contact at GNN on the 15th. The murmuring in the hall turned into a tidal wave of sound. Phones, which had been politely silenced, were now being pulled from pockets and purses. The buzz of Croft's news alert was spreading through the room like a virus. Faces, once smiling and attentive, were now masks of shock. People were looking from their glowing phones to the giant screens, the two sources of information confirming the same unbelievable truth. On stage, Marcus finally sensed the shift. He faltered, his words about truth dying in his throat, as he turned and saw his own treasonous emails displayed for the entire world to see. He froze, his face draining of all color. Beatrice, in the front row, rose slightly from her chair, her face a terrifying mask of incandescent rage. Isabella, for the first time in her life, looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting towards the exits. And then, the grand finale. The main doors of the hall, which had been closed for the speech, swung open with force. But it wasn't late-arriving guests. It was a dozen men and women in dark suits with FBI and SEC insignias on their jackets. They moved through the stunned, parting crowd with a calm, unstoppable purpose. The lead agent walked directly to the stage and approached the paralyzed Marcus. "Marcus Vance," he said, his voice clear and amplified by the microphone Marcus had been using. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit securities fraud and wire fraud." Flashbulbs erupted, turning the scene into a series of surreal, blinding snapshots. A second team of agents intercepted Isabella as she tried to slip away. "Isabella Rossi, you are under arrest for the same." The sounds of the orchestra were replaced by the clicking of handcuffs and the reading of Miranda rights. New York's elite, the most powerful people in the country, stood by, silent and motionless, witnesses to the most spectacular and public implosion they had ever seen. In the quiet of the basement, Alara and Daniel watched it all on their main screen. They saw the flashing lights, the shocked faces, the humiliation of Marcus and Isabella being led away in disgrace. There was no celebration, no high fives, just a profound, heavy silence. Alara watched the feed until Marcus's face disappeared from the screen. Then, with a quiet, final click, she closed the laptop. The ghosts in the machine had finished their haunting. The reckoning was complete. The city was still reeling from the aftershock of the Gala of Reckoning. The arrests of Marcus Vance and Isabella Rossi were the only story that mattered, played on a continuous loop on every news channel. Their perp walks, Marcus looking stunned and broken, Isabella shielding her face with a defiant glare, were the new images defining the Vance name. At the opening bell, Vance Industries stock plummeted with catastrophic speed, wiping out billions in value in a matter of minutes. In the Brooklyn basement, Alara and Daniel monitored the chaos. The beast was wounded, bleeding in public, but they knew the head of the serpent was still coiled, waiting to strike back. Beatrice would not surrender. As they predicted, she made her move. Less than 24 hours after her son's arrest, Beatrice Vance called a press conference. She appeared on the steps of her Fifth Avenue mansion, a solitary figure dressed in stark, mourning black. She looked not like a fallen monarch, but like a grieving matriarch, her face a carefully constructed mask of profound sorrow and steely resolve. The performance was breathtaking in its audacity. "I stand before you today, not as a chairwoman," she began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion, but as a mother whose heart has been broken. She spoke of her shock, her devastation, her complete ignorance of her son's terrible and misguided actions. With tears in her eyes, she publicly disowned him. "The son I raised, the man I knew, would never have been capable of such deceit. It is clear that he was led astray, manipulated by the toxic and predatory influence of Isabella Rossi." She threw Isabella under the bus with Marcus, sacrificing them both on the altar of public opinion. She announced she was stepping down as CEO to focus on healing her family and pledged that the full might of Vance Industries would be used to cooperate with the investigation and make restitution. "The Vance name has been a pillar of this city for a century," she concluded, her voice ringing with false integrity. "I will not allow the reckless actions of one lost soul to tarnish that legacy." In the basement, Daniel let out a low whistle. "She's good," he said, watching the first news polls flash on screen, showing a wave of public sympathy for the grieving mother. "She's brilliant. People are going to buy this. She'll cut Marcus loose and survive this." Alara stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said softly, "they will." For about 5 more minutes, this was the Queen's final, desperate gambit. And now, it was time for Alara's checkmate. She turned to her laptop, to a single, heavily encrypted folder she had held in reserve. It was the one weapon she had not given to Julian Croft, the one she had saved for Beatrice alone. "It's time," she said to Daniel. The Helios scheme was business. To destroy her, we have to make it personal. We have to destroy her legacy. Daniel went to work, not preparing a leak to the press, but crafting two identical, untraceable, digital packages. This information was not for the public, not yet. It was for the people who could use it to tear the kingdom down from within. The contents of the folder were the true dark heart of Beatrice Vance. When they had breached her server, they had found more than just business dealings. They had found her digital soul. Scanned copies of her late husband's original last will and testament dated a week before his death. And right beside it, the revised, forged version that had been filed with the courts. The original will, written by a man aware of his wife's nature and seeking to temper her power, left 40% of his controlling shares in Vance Industries to the family of his estranged younger brother, a man he had secretly reconciled with. The forged will, however, consolidated everything, leaving the entire fortune, the entire empire, under the sole, absolute control of Beatrice. It was the secret foundation of her 40-year reign. The package also contained Beatrice's discreet correspondence with a forger and a lawyer who specialized in disappearing inconvenient heirs. Daniel sent the first package to a quiet, unassuming law professor in California, the grandson of Marcus Vance Sr.'s disinherited brother. The second package went simultaneously to the three most powerful non-Vance members of the Vance Industries Board of Directors. The fallout was not a media explosion. It was a deep, seismic shock that cracked the company's very foundation. The Vance cousins in California, armed with undeniable proof of a breathtaking, decades-long betrayal, didn't just want the money they were owed. They wanted the company. They immediately filed a lawsuit that challenged the very legitimacy of the board and Beatrice's entire tenure. For the board members, it was the final straw. The Helios scandal was a disaster, but it was a business disaster. This was a crime of a different magnitude. It was a foundational rot, a moral cancer that proved their entire corporate structure was built on a lie. It was a betrayal of blood, family, and the sacred trust of a dying man. Faced with a stock price in ruins, a CEO under arrest, and a new legitimate claim to control of the company, their allegiance to Beatrice evaporated. The final scene of Beatrice's reign did not take place in front of cameras, but in the cold, silent theater of the Vance boardroom, the very room where Alara had been so brutally cast out. She was summoned by the board. When she walked in, she was not greeted by her usual deferential subjects. She was met by a tribunal of cold, determined faces, with the lead counsel for the Vance cousins sitting among them. They didn't yell. They didn't accuse. They simply laid out the facts and presented their non-negotiable demand: her immediate and permanent resignation from all Vance entities. Her reign was over. The game was lost. She, the master manipulator, had been outmaneuvered. She walked out of the boardroom, her face a pale, blank mask. She crossed the vast marble lobby of the building that bore her name, but no one rushed to open the door. The employees who had once lived in fear of her now just stared, some with pity, most with contempt. Her power, her influence, her very identity had vanished. She was no longer the empress. She was just a ghost, haunting the ruins of a legacy she had spent a lifetime building and had lost in a single day. In the basement, a news alert flashed on the main screen. Beatrice Vance resigns amidst new family lawsuit challenging control of empire. The headline was quiet, professional, and more devastating than any accusation of fraud. Daniel leaned back, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. He looked at Alara, who was watching the news report with a quiet, weary intensity. "Is it over?" he asked. Alara stared at the crumbling dynasty on the screen. She thought of the woman in the morning dress, the boy on the audio recording, and the long, dark road that had led her to this concrete room. The queen was toppled. The board was cleared. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's over." 6 months after the fall, the world had moved on. The name Vance, once a synonym for power and prestige, was now a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and a footnote in the history of Wall Street's great collapses. In a quiet, sun-drenched cafe in a small coastal town in Oregon, a woman named Ella Linden looked out at the Pacific Ocean, watching the waves patiently erasing the sand. The news, when she chose to read it, was a distant echo. Vance Industries had been dismantled, its assets sold off to competitors. The Vance cousins, armed with the truth, had won their staggering lawsuit and were now using their fortune to build something new. Marcus was in a medium-security federal prison, his name and face already fading from public memory. And Beatrice, the Empress of Lies, was living in a state of self-imposed exile in a small, undisclosed European town, stripped of her company, her fortune, and the legacy she had killed to protect. The war was over. The silence that followed was peace. Alara, now Ella, had been legally and publicly exonerated, but she never went back. She had no desire to reclaim a world that was never truly hers. With the modest settlement she received from the Vance estate, she had simply disappeared, building a new life where her name meant nothing more than the woman who paid her rent on time. She worked as a freelance data consultant, her clients unaware that the quiet, brilliant woman who optimized their logistics once brought down an empire. She and Daniel had parted ways, their alliance fulfilled. He had used his share of the whistleblower reward from the cousins' lawsuit to found a thriving cybersecurity firm, a testament to a reputation he had rightfully reclaimed. They remained silent partners in a war that was won, two ghosts who had found their way back into the light. Yet, for Alara, one question had always lingered in the quiet moments. One mystery remained. Who had sent the USB drive? Who had slipped that first, crucial key under her door? It was the catalyst, the spark that had ignited everything. It was an anonymous act of faith from a complete stranger, and she had never known who to thank. One morning, a letter arrived. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, postmarked from a small village in the English countryside. The handwriting was a precise, elegant script from a bygone era. With a sense of trepidation, she opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages long, and the old, scratched black USB drive. She began to read. The letter was from Arthur Pennington, the man who had been the Vance family's butler for 45 years. He was a quiet, dignified presence who had been so much a part of the scenery of her old life that she had barely seen him. He wrote that he was now retired, living out his days in the village where he was born. He wrote of his life inside the great and terrible house of Vance. He had been a young footman when he first met Charlotte Vance, Marcus Sr.'s younger sister. He described her not as a socialite, but as a woman of profound kindness and intellect, the true moral compass of the family. And he confessed, in his reserved, elegant prose, that he had loved her from an impossible distance. He then recounted, as a silent witness, how he had watched Beatrice's methodical and venomous campaign to isolate Charlotte from her brother, planting seeds of distrust until the kind-hearted sister was cast out and written out of the family will. It was Beatrice's first, and perhaps cruelest, masterpiece of betrayal. Years later, a dying Marcus Sr., haunted by his guilt, had given the audio recording to Arthur, the only person in the house he knew he could trust. "He told me to give this to the right person when the time comes," Arthur wrote. "He said I would know them by their character, not their name." Arthur had waited. He had watched Marcus grow into a hollow echo of his mother, and then he had watched Alara. He saw her intelligence, her integrity, and the quiet dignity with which she endured Beatrice's endless, subtle cruelties. He saw the same light in her that he had once seen in Charlotte. "When they cast you out, Miss Linden," the letter concluded, "with nothing but a box and their lies, I knew the time had come. I did not light the spark of your vengeance. That fire was already yours. I merely handed the match to the one person I knew had the courage to build an inferno." Alara carefully folded the letter, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Her war had been part of an older, longer story. Her personal quest for justice had been the fulfillment of a silent, 40-year-old promise. In the grand, brutal game of life, the powerful often forget a simple rule of chess. Even the smallest pawn, if it can endure the entire bloody length of the board, can be reborn as a queen. They forget that the silence of those who have been wronged is not an absence of sound, but the drawing of a deep and patient breath. Never underestimate the quiet of a person who has endured too much, because when they finally decide to speak, their voice can carry the force of a hurricane. When they finally decide to act, their hands can bring down an empire. Back in the cafe, Alara looked at the old USB drive in her hand, then out at the endless, churning ocean. She thought of Arthur, the quiet keeper of secrets, and of the justice he had so patiently served. She put the drive away, a relic of a life that was no longer hers. A real, unburdened smile touched her lips, a smile of true and absolute freedom. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading through her, chasing away the last of the shadows. The story of the Vances is over, but the secrets in other families, in other gilded cages, are still waiting to be told. See you in the next story.